The building we see directly across from us there dates to around 1800, and it was originally a single-family residence. That's quite a home, wouldn't you say? It was originally the home of a Mr. and Mrs. McCarty. They were very wealthy socialites here at the time, and theirs are the grandest, most extravagant of all social gatherings. Only the finest food would be served, only the finest music played. Everyone who was anyone would attend, and people would come from far and from wide. But as the couple grew on in years, it became quite clear that they could no longer continue this tradition as they once had. So they would eventually pass the property down to their oldest daughter, whose name was Delphine. Now, it had recently, prior to that, happened that Delphine had married a young, aspiring surgeon by the name of Dr. Louis LaLaurie. So Louis and Delphine would move together into this house and seek to continue the same tradition as begun by her parents. Only the finest food would be served, only the finest music played, everyone who was anyone would attend, and people would come from far and from wide. But there was trouble in paradise, you see, because this was prior to the abolition of slavery. And at the time, it was the accepted practice that if you were to purchase an enslaved individual, that you would purchase him or her, ideally at a young age, so as theoretically to assure years of faithful service. This is why it came across to many as being really unheard of that on every seemingly successive occasion, there's a different crew serving the food. Well, this should never happen, should it? But people were enjoying themselves so much, they were having such a grand time of it, that no one wanted to say anything that would disrupt all the fun. So, this area would have, this issue, I should say, would and did come to a head on one, in an extreme way, on one particular evening in the month of April of 1834, when one of the revelers, standing right about where we are on this opposite side of the street, notices that billowing out of a second-story window near that courtyard that you see is a very thick plume of black smoke. Well, where there is smoke, there must be fire, so they immediately ran down to the nearby fire station. Firefighters would arrive here a short time later. Buckets in hand, they made their way up to that second-story room where it appeared that the blaze had started. As they get up to that second room, they are startled to find that an elderly enslaved woman is found crouched on the floor, with her ankles shackled and chained to the legs of the cast iron stove that had caught fire to the drapes behind it. Immediately they took their buckets, dousing the blaze, extinguishing it only moments before what would have undoubtedly become an agonizing demise. So she was very incoherent. She could barely speak, but did manage to say the following words. Go upstairs, look upstairs, and you'll find the answer there. Now, what could that mean? So Louis and Delphine, they're standing closely thereby, and they're saying, listen, you don't want to listen to this old woman. She is senile. She doesn't know what she's talking about. The reason we had her chained up was because she tried to run away on us before. So thank you for saving our home. Now let's all just sort of go about our business, shall we? Fair enough, said the firefighters, so they began to walk away. But as they began to walk away, they began to think to themselves, I wonder what that old woman was really talking about. I wonder what really is going on upstairs on the third floor of that house. So secretly, quietly, with their ladders, they made their way back into the house. And without anyone noticing, they would arrive at that second-story gallery that you see, and they would rest the top of the ladder against that cornice that separates the second from the third floors. Just below that second window from the left, up at the very top on the third story, the one that has since been plastered over. You'll have to take my word for it when I say that at the time, it was a regular glass window just like all the rest of them. So they began to scale the ladders, and as they get up to the top, they lift open the window, and immediately the most noxious stench they'd ever encountered hit their senses. And as they pull back the drapes and step into the room, what they discover inside was described in the morning newspaper as the single most horrific sight of carnage ever witnessed by human eyes. Every interior wall of the third level of this house is lined with the bodies, some living, some deceased, of enslaved individuals, each one of whom had some kind of horrible, primeval, experimental surgery performed. We're talking about primitive lobotomies, gashes cut into the flesh, limbs amputated. One young woman was reduced to a head and a torso as her arms and legs had been severed from her body without a bit of anesthesia, so that she was left to flail about enclosed in an iron cage. These firefighters immediately became sick to their stomachs. They'd never seen anything so grotesque, but they knew they had a job to do. We have got to save whomever we can save. So they would run down to a nearby hospital, and help would arrive here a short time later. Now, In the meantime, a crowd had gathered here out onto the intersection. Louis and Delphine, they're trying to basically shush the crowd. Listen, there's nothing to see here. The fire has been put out. So sure enough, people began to calm themselves until the gates to the courtyard swing open, and from them emerge on stretchers the first of the tortured slaves, the second of the tortured slaves, the third and the fourth, and so on. This horrible, grisly deed was finally being brought to light in a most extreme way. You have to understand that even prior to the abolition of slavery, this would have been considered an absolute atrocity. People were furious. They wanted to kill Louis and Delphine. How dare they do such a thing? But this couple was far too clever to be undone. Immediately they rushed back inside of the house, locking themselves inside. Only minutes later, the doors to the carriage house swing open, and from them emerge, in a horse-drawn carriage, Louis and Delphine and their essential belongings. Bound they were for the Mississippi River. Of course, people tried to chase after them, but all to no avail. To this day, it doesn't appear that this couple would ever again return to New Orleans. What we do know is that this building would stand vacant for some nearly 40 years after that. It would not be until the 1870s, really, that a very wealthy landowner would purchase this building and divide it up as rentals. But strangely, as some tenants were moving in, others were moving out, each claiming to have encountered some rather disturbing paranormal occurrences. They would say that you would hear what sounded like these echoing voices resonating throughout the house. So you could hear what sounded like chains rattling from within the walls. Time and again, people would try to develop this property, and time and again, tenants would run screaming from it. One particular property owner, having read of what happened on that fateful night in 1834, decided to have that second window from the left up on the third story plastered over so that theoretically no one would ever have to look upon those same horrific sights as encountered by those firefighters on that dreadful evening. It was more symbolic than anything else. So, as of about 4 months ago, there were people living here in peace, seemingly. These were rental properties. Some claim that the building has simply been refurbished and remodeled so many times that the ghosts, the territorial beings that they are, no longer recognize this property as familiar territory. Others claim that in the 1970s, at the height of the parapsychology movement, that this building was visited by a group of mediums who sought to exorcise the building. That is to say, chase away evil spirits. I happen to have been talking to a person, a friend of mine who happened to know as a computer technician. He was telling me one night he was visiting a friend who was living here at the time, and he's working on his friend's computer when he happens to hear this loud slamming sound coming from behind him. He turns and he notices on the opposite wall that there's this painting that is literally lifting itself off the wall and slamming itself back onto the wall. He nearly jumps out of his skin and politely informs his friend, "If you ever have any more trouble with your computer, please call someone else. I'm not going back in there." Now, one property owner, having read of what happened on that fateful night in 1834, decided to have that second window from the left up at the very top plastered over as a kind of symbolic gesture so that theoretically no one would ever have to look upon those same horrid sights as encountered by those firefighters on that dreadful evening. It was more symbolic than anything else. Today, this house is once again a single residence. Earlier this year, it was purchased. It is today one of 2 houses in the city, one of several in the United States, currently owned by a certain actor, Nicolas Cage. So, the next story I want to share with you is not as widely told as this one, but it's just about as wonderfully disturbing as you will learn.
Crazy though.
Nicolas Cage.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I don't like it.
I don't either.
Nicolas Cage's crib.
I'm like falling asleep standing there.
That must be his house down there then.
He owns all that shit, and it's all one crib.
That's amazing. Wow.
It's all one fucking house.